31 years of marriage, and I learned what my wife really thought of me while hiding behind a rack of coats at a Salvation Army thrift store. That's not how I planned to spend a Tuesday afternoon in October. I was supposed to pick up a pie. My daughter, our youngest, Ellie, had asked me to stop by the bakery on Crescent Street before coming to her place for dinner. Simple enough. But the bakery was closed early, some kind of staff emergency. So I figured I'd walk down the block and kill 15 minutes before heading back to my car. It was cold, that particular kind of cold that comes in off Lake Erie in the fall. The kind that gets into your collar before you even realize it. The thrift store on the corner had its lights on. I ducked inside. I wasn't looking for anything. I was just warm. I was 63 years old. My knees ached from the drive, and I wanted 3 minutes out of the wind. That's when I heard her voice. My wife's voice, and she was laughing. Not the polite laugh she used at dinner parties. The real one. The one I hadn't heard her use with me in a long time. I didn't move. I was near the back, between a rack of winter coats and a shelf of old hardcovers nobody wanted. She was somewhere near the front, past the furniture section, maybe by the housewares. I couldn't see her, but I could hear her perfectly. She was on the phone. "He still doesn't know," she said. Then that laugh again. "Gordon, he genuinely has no idea. I've been doing this for 8 months. 8 months. I stood completely still. My hand was resting on the sleeve of somebody's old wool coat, and I remember the texture of it, scratchy, dense, slightly damp from the cold outside, because I held on to it like it was the only solid thing in the room. Gordon was my brother-in-law, her brother. They'd always been close. I'd always been fine with that. I was not fine with this. "The accountant is set," she said. "Once the transfer goes through, the Milford property goes into the LLC, and his name isn't on it. He signed the papers in August. He thinks it was a routine refinance." I don't remember sitting down, but at some point I was sitting on a wooden chair that someone had left beside the coat rack. My legs had just made that decision for me. I'd signed papers in August. Ellen had put a stack of documents in front of me on a Sunday morning while I was drinking coffee and watching the pregame coverage. She'd said our financial advisor recommended restructuring some assets for tax purposes. She'd said it was routine. She'd had a pen ready. I was 63 years old. I'd worked for 37 years as a civil engineer for the county. I'd helped build 3 bridges, 2 highway interchanges, and a water treatment facility that served 400,000 people. I knew how to read a structural load calculation to 4 decimal places. I had not read those papers carefully enough. I know, Ellen was saying. But once everything's settled, I can finally, yes. Yes, exactly. I heard her move slightly. A shopping cart shifted somewhere near the front. "He's been so distracted lately. Work, the grandkids, whatever. He barely notices anything I do. It makes it easier, honestly. He just signs whatever I put in front of him." Distracted. Yes. I supposed I had been distracted. We'd had our first grandchild in June. Our son Neil's little boy, born 6 weeks early, spent 3 weeks in the NICU. I'd been distracted by that. I'd been distracted by my father's estate, which had taken 11 months to settle after he passed. I'd been distracted by a knee surgery in March that had kept me off my feet for 6 weeks. I'd been distracted by being alive. She kept talking. Her voice was almost cheerful. There was no guilt in it that I could detect, not even the sound of someone who'd wrestled with something hard and made peace with it. Just ease, just lightness. "The house is the last piece," she said. "I haven't moved on the house yet. That's the tricky part. Our house. The one we'd bought in 1997. The one we'd repainted 3 times and re-roofed once and replaced the furnace in twice. The one where we'd raised 2 kids and hosted 40 Christmases and argued about the thermostat for 3 decades. She was planning something with our house. I didn't walk out. Something in me, some old engineering instinct, the part that knew you never pulled a load-bearing wall before you understood the whole structure, told me to stay still and keep listening. "I've already talked to someone," she said. "Someone who handles these things quietly. Gordon, I'm not stupid. I know what I'm doing. By the time he figures any of this out, it'll be too late to undo. By the time he figures any of this out, me. By then I had taken my phone out of my pocket. I don't know exactly when I made the decision. But I opened the voice memo app and pressed record and set the phone face down on my knee. And I sat there in that wooden chair beside the coat rack, and I listened to my wife of 31 years tell her brother how she was going to finish dismantling the life we had built together. She talked for another 9 minutes. I know because when I stopped the recording, the timestamp read 9 minutes and 44 seconds. She talked about a man named Charles, not in a romantic way, or at least not explicitly, but in a way that made it clear he was someone she'd been confiding in for some time. Someone who had encouraged her, someone who apparently had his own financial interests in what she was arranging, though she was careful about what she actually said. She talked about wanting to be free. She used that word 3 times. Free. She talked about how she'd stayed too long, how she'd given too much, how she deserved something of her own, something I couldn't touch. She talked about me the way you talk about a building you're finally getting around to tearing down. No anger, no grief, just logistics. I turned the recording off when I heard her say goodbye to Gordon. I heard the particular sound of her putting her phone in her purse. I knew that sound, the snap of the clasp, and I heard her footsteps moving toward the back of the store. I got up and walked deeper into the coat racks and stayed there until I heard her leave. Then I stood in that thrift store for a long time, alone, between the old coats and the old books. And I thought about what I was going to do. Here's what I knew. I was not going to make a scene. I was not going to go home and confront her that evening with nothing but a phone recording and 31 years of hurt. I'd built too many things over too many years to tear them down without understanding the full structure first. You don't pull a wall until you know what it's holding up. I drove to my daughter Ellie's house without the pie. I apologized and said the bakery was closed. She made tea, and we sat at her kitchen table, and I played with my granddaughter's toy horses while Ellie talked about her week. And I listened, and I nodded, and I did not say a word about what had happened. That evening, after I got home, I went down to the basement office on the pretense of finishing some project paperwork. Ellen was watching television upstairs. I could hear the sound of it through the floor. I started making calls. The first was to my son Neil, not to tell him everything, just to ask, carefully, whether he knew a good family attorney. He said a colleague at his firm had recently used someone for an estate matter. A woman named Hargrove, apparently very thorough. I wrote the name down. The second call was to a financial advisor who'd handled some of my retirement accounts separately from our joint assets. I'd used him before Ellen and I had consolidated things. I told him I needed a full accounting of my individual assets, and I needed it quickly and quietly. He asked no questions. The third call was to a man I'd worked with on a county project years before. He'd gone private since then and did consulting work. Among other things, he knew people who could locate and review documents. I told him I needed someone to look at a refinancing agreement I'd signed in August. I told him I thought something was wrong with it. He said he'd have someone look at it within 48 hours. I went upstairs at 10 o'clock. Ellen was already in bed, her light off, her breathing slow and even. I stood in the doorway for a moment in the dark. 31 years. We'd met at a company picnic. She'd been dating a friend of a colleague of mine, and somehow by the end of the afternoon we'd ended up talking for 2 hours about absolutely nothing important. I remembered that. I remembered the way she'd laughed at something stupid I said, and how I'd thought, I want to hear that again. I went to bed. I did not sleep much. Over the following 3 weeks, I learned things. The August refinancing papers were not routine. They contained a provision that transferred a significant portion of the equity in our investment property, a rental house in Milford that we'd owned for 16 years, into an LLC that my wife had established 6 months earlier. My name was not on the LLC. I had signed the papers without reading them carefully enough. That was on me. But the framing of what she'd told me, routine, tax purposes, the advisor recommended it, had been deliberate. There was also, according to the documents my contact located, a second property filing that had not yet been completed. It appeared to involve our primary residence. Whatever she was planning with the house, she hadn't finished it yet. I met with the attorney Hargrove, as Neil had suggested, on a Thursday morning at a discreet office near downtown. She was in her 50s, practical, no excess words. She listened to everything I told her. She listened to the recording. She did not react dramatically to any of it. She asked me what outcome I wanted. I thought about that for a moment. I told her I wanted what was mine. I wanted what we had built together to be divided honestly, not taken. I told her I did not want revenge. I wanted documentation. I wanted the truth of what had happened to be clear and on record. She said that was workable. What followed was another 4 weeks of quiet preparation. I will not pretend it was easy. I went home every night and had dinner with my wife and watched the news and talked about ordinary things. And every night I carried this weight by myself. There were moments when I almost said something. When she passed me the salt shaker and our hands touched briefly. When she laughed at something on television and I heard that laugh, the real one, and remembered that I used to be the one who caused it. I did not say anything. I waited. The night I finally ended it, I had chosen carefully. It was a Sunday. Our son Neil was at his in-laws for the weekend. Ellie was 2 hours away. There would be no interruptions. I waited until she had put down her book and turned off her reading lamp. Then I turned mine back on. I said her name. She looked at me. I placed 3 things on the bedside table. The attorney's summary of the Milford LLC transfer and its legal implications. A printed transcript of the relevant portions of the recording. I'd had it transcribed professionally. And a single sheet of paper that was a formal notice of intent to file for divorce, prepared by Hargrove's office. Ellen didn't say anything for a long time. Then she said, "Where did you get that?" Not a question, just words. I told her about the thrift store. I told her about the coat rack. I told her about the coat rack. I told her about sitting in that wooden chair for 9 minutes and 44 seconds. She said, "That was a private conversation." I said yes, it was. And what was in it was information that I needed in order to protect myself, so I had kept it. She said it wasn't what it sounded like. I said I had given her a moment to say that, out of 31 years of courtesy, and that I would listen if she wanted to explain. But I also told her that the LLC existed, that I had the filings, that the Milford property had been moved without my full and informed consent, and that a second filing involving our residence had been initiated and not yet completed, and that Hargrove's office had already taken steps to flag it. The room was very quiet. Ellen sat up against the headboard with her arms folded and stared at the wall for a while. She was not crying. That surprised me somehow. I don't know what I expected. Eventually she said, "I was going to talk to you." I said I knew, but she was going to talk to me after the house was already gone. She didn't answer that. I told her the attorney would be in contact with her, and that I hoped she would get her own attorney, someone who would advise her honestly. I told her I wasn't interested in a fight. I was interested in a fair settlement, and I intended to have one. I slept in the guest room that night, and the night after, and the night after that. The divorce took 8 months. It was not warm. It was not friendly. There were difficult conversations and some very tense ones, and there was a period of 3 weeks when her attorney tried to make an argument about the Milford property that Hargrove dismantled in about 20 minutes at the deposition. The recording was not admissible in court. Ohio's laws on that are complicated, but what it had allowed me to do was know where to look and what to protect, and that had made all the difference. The Milford property was returned to joint marital assets and divided accordingly. The primary residence was sold. We split the proceeds. My pension and retirement accounts, which I'd moved promptly and properly into protected status, remained mine. Her separate LLC, and whatever she had been building with it and with whoever Charles was, remained hers. I moved into an apartment near the lake. 2nd floor, 2 bedrooms. The 2nd bedroom is for when Ellie's kids visit, which they do. My grandson likes to sit on the floor and build things out of wooden blocks, and I sit with him, and we build towers, and he knocks them down and laughs, and I think that is about the right way to feel about most things. Neil called me a few months after the finalization. He asked how I was doing, really doing. I told him I was fine. He said that was a complicated word. I said, yes, it is. We talked for a long time. Ellie asked me once during those 8 months why I hadn't come to her the night it happened, why I had sat at her kitchen table and said nothing while she talked about her week. I told her I didn't want to put it on her before I understood it myself. I told her that some things you have to carry alone for a while, not forever, but long enough to know their weight before you start handing pieces to the people you love. She said that was very much like me. I said I'd take that. There are things I could be bitter about. I know that. I could spend the rest of my years on that 2nd floor apartment cataloging everything that was taken and everything that was lied about and everything I should have seen sooner. I spent a few weeks doing exactly that. At 3 in the morning with the lake wind coming off the water and the old apartment making its old noises. And then I stopped. Not because I wasn't hurt. I was. I still am. In certain rooms I don't visit very often anymore. But because bitterness is a structure that holds nothing up, I built enough real things in my life to know the difference. I still drive past that Salvation Army on Crescent Street sometimes. The lights are usually on. I've never gone back inside. But I think about that wooden chair. I think about sitting down in it and not running. About taking out my phone with steady hands and pressing record. Staying still when everything in you wants to move. That's not passivity. That's the hardest kind of courage there is. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is wait until you understand the whole structure before you decide what to pull. I know that now. I knew it then too, I think. I just didn't know I knew it. I keep thinking about that wooden chair. Not the thrift store, not the coat rack, not even the recording. Just that chair. The fact that I sat down in it instead of walking out. That I stayed still when every nerve in my body was telling me to stand up and do something loud and immediate and irreversible. I thought a lot about what made the difference between the man who sat down and the man who might have walked out and made a scene. I don't think it was calm exactly. I wasn't calm. My hands were shaking by the time I pressed record. I think what it was something closer to character. The kind that doesn't show up in the good times, only under pressure, only when the floor drops out and you find out what's actually underneath you. Ellen made choices over 8 months that she believed were invisible. She moved carefully, quietly, and with patience. What she miscalculated was this, that I would do the same. She looked at a man who trusted her, and mistook that trust for inattention. She looked at a man who signed papers without reading them carefully enough, and mistook that for permanent. People who rely on deception tend to underestimate the people they're deceiving because they have to. It keeps the whole thing running. But here's what I know about cause and effect. Having built things for most of my adult life, every load gets transferred somewhere. You can hide a structural problem for a while. You can paper over it, route around it, sign the documents at the right moment. Eventually, though, the load finds the weak point. What Ellen was building was always going to collapse. The only question was whether I would be standing in the rubble or standing to the side of it with documentation in my hand. I chose to stand to the side. That took intelligence. Not the kind you're born with, but the kind you choose to use. The discipline to stop and think rather than react. To ask what I actually knew, what I could prove, what the whole structure looked like before I pulled anything. I was 63 years old, and I had spent 4 decades learning how to look at something complicated and not flinch and not rush and not pretend I understood it before I did. It turned out that skill wasn't only for bridges. And it took something harder than intelligence. It took the will to keep going when I didn't want to have dinner and pass the salt and say goodnight, and go downstairs and make phone calls and get up the next morning and do it again for weeks, carrying the weight of it alone because I wasn't ready to put it down yet. There were nights when I thought about stopping. Not anything dramatic, just stopping the process, walking away from the documentation, letting things go because the fight was exhausting, and I was tired, and 63 is too old to start over. I didn't stop. Not because I was certain it would work out. I didn't know it would work out. I kept going because stopping would have been a different kind of surrender than the obvious one. And I had too much self-respect left to do that. Neil asked me once if I was angry at her. I told him I'd moved past angry pretty quickly because angry wasn't useful and I didn't have the energy to carry it. What I felt more than anger was something I don't have a clean word for. A kind of grief, maybe, but also a kind of clarity. Like something that had been blurry for years had finally come into focus, and the image wasn't what I'd hoped, but at least now I could see it plainly. You can't rebuild on a bad foundation. You can't rebuild on a bad foundation. You can patch it. You can work around it. You can spend decades not looking at it too closely. But eventually you have to decide whether to keep living on ground that won't hold, or find solid ground and start again. I'm on the 2nd floor now looking out at the lake. My grandson is coming this weekend. He likes to build things out of blocks and knock them down and laugh. I understand that more than I used to.